We are Area 51 Coffee Company. Coffee for regular humans and coffee with twice the caffeine of a typical cup with a buzz that's out of this world. Coffee connoisseurs from across the galaxy seek out our smooth brew with a hint of sweetness in a perfect roast. Area51coffeeco.com. You will also be assimilated with our Area 51 merchandise. We are invading Earth one cup at a time. We are Area 51 Coffee Company. Area51coffeeco.com.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic threw their plans against us.
Prior to your abduction, did you believe in UFOs or any sort of alien life form?
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Hello, all you unexplained ones, and welcome back to All Things Unexplained. My name is Dr. Mouse. I'm an author, a narrator, a professor, and a podcaster. Shout out to Smitty and CJ who could not join us. And I also want to give a special shout out to everybody in the chat right now. Thank you so much for joining us early. You can all help us by hitting that subscribe button down below, by making sure to comment on this video, making sure to hit the like button, and please make sure to share this video. When you do that, it really helps us defeat the evil algorithms that are trying to prevent disclosure. So again, shout out to all the listeners in the chat, everybody watching the video. You're here to see special guest Kevin Knuth, a renowned physicist and researcher. You might recognize him from his appearance on television shows like Encounters and A Tear in the Sky, where he explored mysteries beyond our understanding. Dr. Knuth is also a key figure in UAPs, the organization dedicated to unraveling the secrets of unidentified aerial phenomenon. Everybody, please welcome Professor Kevin Knuth to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm impressed that people are listening in the UK and Australia. The people in the UK are up really late, and I guess the people from Australia are up really early. So, and it's almost the same at this point.
That's right. We have a lot of fans in Australia, and some of them actually have a webcam set up, trained to the night sky deep in the heart of Australia, and you can just watch for UFOs all night long on YouTube. It's really quite amazing. We're here tonight to discuss the recent AARO report. And for those listeners that don't know, AARO stands for the All-Domain Anomalous Resolution Office. That's right, the latest in acronyms, the All-Domain Anomalous Resolution Office. One thing I can't understand, Dr. Knuth, is if everything is just a prosaic explanation, a weather balloon or a natural phenomenon, then why exactly do we need an all-domain anomalous resolution office?
That's a big hint, isn't it? It's a big hint that they're not telling you everything that they're not talking about everything they should be talking about. It's all domain because these things are seen in the oceans too. And there recently was a report, I think it was a Soul Foundation white paper put off by Admiral Gallaudet on unidentified submerged objects and how they are very much neglected, and I would agree with that.
That's a great point about USOs, Dr. Knuth, and I definitely hope we'll circle back there later on in the show. If you're not familiar with the AARO report that just came out in spring, February or March of 2024, this is my favorite headline about the report. Headline says, "No proof the U.S. government knows anything about UFOs. says the U.S. government. Subheadline: A Pentagon report claims no U.S. government investigation has any proof of extraterrestrial technology, but that's exactly what they would say. That's by Owen Bellwood. No proof the U.S. government knows anything about UFOs, says the U.S. government.
I find it interesting that the title of that I find interesting. So if there's no proof that the U.S. government knows anything about UFOs, then why even look to them for answers, right?
There can be no doubt that the government certainly wants us to depend on them for all the answers. They would love it if we would just sit back on the couch and wait for them to provide all of life's answers. Dr. Knuth, one thing I noticed about the AARO report is that they really seem to just rely on their own science, their own scientists, their own articles, and they really just kind of pick and choose what they put in their reports and what they disseminate to the public. And so your work, for example, is basically completely ignored, as is work by a lot of other great physicists. And I know that has to be really frustrating to you.
Right. We keep looking to the U.S. government for answers, yet from what they tell us, there's no proof that they know anything. So I think, and I think that the AARO report would really does confirm that to some degree. That's a big problem. You should take advantage of all the resources available, and they clearly don't. They want a particular group of particular cadre of people with only certain amounts of expertise and certain reach to handle these things. And that was true of the NASA panel too. NASA panel, I was surprised by it because they gathered together, a bunch of experts, but none of them were current or former NASA people who studied UAPs. None of them had ever studied UAPs before. Where I'm a former NASA employee, I study UAPs. I know at least 6 or 7 other current and former NASA people who have studied UAPs. Any one of them would have been great to have on that panel. They could have been a valuable resource. And in fact, when NASA formed its panel, several of us contacted each other and asked, were you asked to be on the panel? Were you? And we were all rather surprised that we weren't. And there was some discussion as to whether we should write some kind of editorial pointing out that none of us were asked. None of our expertise was tapped. Why is that? That's a good question.
Okay, let's dig right into this AARO report now. They basically had one main conclusion, and that is that no evidence UFOs are off-world technology or a part of a classified program that had not been properly reported to Congress. They also had 2 sub-conclusions. Most sightings were the result of misidentification of ordinary objects and phenomena, and although many UAP reports remain unsolved, AARO assesses that if additional quality data were available, of course, most of these cases could also be identified and resolved as ordinary objects or phenomenon. So AARO says, hey, everything is a prosaic explanation, and if we don't know what it is, it's also a prosaic explanation. What do you think about this, Dr. Knuth?
So first, there's no evidence that UFOs are off-world technology. Well, that is not surprising for a few reasons. First, what would it take to prove that it was off-world? To prove that something's extraterrestrial is quite a high bar. You'd have to prove that it comes from another planet, and that's difficult to do. Now, off-world technology, well, even Congress has changed their terminology. They don't use the term extraterrestrial anymore. They use the term non-human. And for good reason, because all evidence that we have seen points to the fact that whoever these peoples are who make these objects or use these objects they live here on Earth. The reaction time is way too fast to come from anywhere else. Even Carl Sagan pointed out, and this was his argument against UFOs being interstellar craft, was that he had a hard time believing that you had interstellar spacecraft arriving at Earth every other week. And I would totally agree with that. Would be hard to believe. But I would also grab him by the shoulders and say, all right, Carl, you've almost got it. Go one step further. They're not coming from another star system. Yes, they live here. That's the obvious thing, and I think that's the problem. Now, we at UAPX had been, we briefed AARO at one point in last year in February, a little more than a year ago. We've briefed several other three-letter government organizations, and we briefed the House Armed Services Committee, and every single one of those briefings, we were asked the question, what are your capabilities for observing underwater? That was asked every time, and clearly, again, the issue of unidentified submerged objects is a big deal, and clearly related to the UFO problem. So, so that's an important thing that's missing from this report. Of course, the first point here, most sightings were the result of misidentification of ordinary objects and phenomena. That is absolutely true. People who studied UFOs have been saying that for years. It's the 3%, the residual that you can't explain that's interesting. And their last statement is rather silly. Although many UAP reports remain unsolved, AARO assesses that if additional quality data were available, most could be identified as being prosaic, basically. So how can they assess that if they don't have enough data? You can't assess that without data, and that's the whole point of collecting data. So that last statement's really pretty ridiculous.
Well, it really is ridiculous. It's such an opinionated statement. It's almost as if they're going out of their way to bat down anything that goes against what their narrative is.
This whole report is almost like the authors have a chip on their shoulder and are going after the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And that in itself is unscientific. You don't go after a hypothesis. What you do is you try to figure out what things are. You try to rule out hypotheses. Now, if they can rule out a extraterrestrial hypothesis, great, but you're not going to rule it out this way. So this is, the whole approach there is unscientific in the first place. And this is supposed to be a historical report of the government's involvement with UAPs. And from that perspective, it's lacking.
Okay, listener Pepito says, simply AARO lies. Thanks for that input, listener Pepito.
Yeah, there's a good bit of that going on, it appears. There's a good bit of dishonesty still. And it's disconcerting, especially because we're in a situation here in the U.S. now where we have a great mistrust of our government. And if you're worried about mistrust, the first thing to do is be truthful. And be obviously truthful. And that's not happening here.
Dr. Knuth, this really reminds me of the novel by Orwell, 1984. And there's some quotes from 1984 that this AARO report really makes me think about. One of them is, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And it's like AARO is really trying to control the present here, and in doing so, control the past and the future. They're really trying to wrap all that up here in this single AARO report. Another great quote, the best books are those that tell you what you already know. And that's exactly what it feels like AARO is trying to do here. And because the conclusions in this report were so lacking and so inadequate, it left a lot of unanswered questions. And this comes from author Graf in Wired on March 11th, 2024. And some of those unanswered questions were this: if they're not anomalous, could it be secret tech from foreign nations or even secret United States tech?
Right. Again, here in this whole topic, there's a lot to unpack. First, UAP and even UFOs are not going to be just one thing. They're a class of objects, and so it's not clear that Some of them are going to be weather balloons, right? Some of them are birds. Some of them are drones. And some of them very possibly are secret U.S. tech. In fact, we know that this is the case in some cases. Some of the objects that had been reported in the 60s were described as match up with a U-2 spy plane. Not surprising. And some of them could easily be foreign tech. And some of them still could be non-human craft. That doesn't rule that out. So just having a bunch of CIA projects that happen to match a bunch of UFO sightings does not at all rule out non-human craft. It just makes the percentage smaller, which is what you would expect. You'd expect a smaller percentage rather than a large one. So that's not surprising. And the whole question about them not being anomalous, you can already see there's some disingenuity, because Kirkpatrick showed a video of that metallic sphere over Mosul, Iraq, and said that was unidentified. And that he also noted that they had been seen all over the world. So metallic spheres just don't fly around. Apparently they do. They had been observed as Foo Fighters since World War II. So this is part of the history. And I don't recall off the top of my head whether he talks about Foo Fighters from World War II in the report. That would have been important, especially if you're going to parade around a video of a metallic sphere in Iraq. So where is the explanation of what that sphere is if it's not anomalous? It looks pretty anomalous to me if it's a metallic sphere. Where are the lift surfaces? What is the propulsion device? Those are questions I'd ask as a scientist or an engineer.
You brought up misidentified military crafts, Dr. Knuth, and one thing I've always wondered is, what is the comparison between unidentified military craft by civilians versus unidentified military craft by military personnel? Because one thing I have to question is our military testing its own technology against itself or against other branches that are completely unaware of the test or the technology?
Well, that's a good question too, and I don't know what their procedures are. And so that's something that they may need to they may have to review internally at some point if that's what's going on. But pilots need to know what's in the air, period. Both commercial pilots and military pilots and private pilots all need to know what is in the air. And so if you are flying test craft in populated places where there are other airplanes, that's a safety hazard, period. And if pilots are seeing things that they can't identify, that's a safety hazard. They need to be identified, and pilots need to be educated as to what they can see. And this is a big problem. It's a safety hazard, period. And for AARO just to say, well, there's nothing anomalous here, nothing to worry about, nothing to see here. Well, pilots are still seeing things, and commercial pilots are seeing things. And that means you haven't answered the question as to what they are, and you haven't done your job. And I worry about that.
Well, I tell you what, Dr. Knuth, if it is adversary tech, that would be pretty brazen right there.
Yes, definitely would. Yeah. Well, the Chinese balloons are brazen. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Wars are started over things like that. It's very dangerous.
And as a matter of fact, we shot down 3 UFOs over Super Bowl weekend, and we still don't know what those were all about. We don't have any pictures. We don't have any videos. We don't have any information. One was over or near Dead Horse, Alaska, and we just don't know anything. The only thing we ever knew was they tried to blame it on a child's Pico balloon, but we actually had the basically creator of the Pico balloons involved in this situation. We essentially proved that this could not have been a child's Pico balloon. All right, I love this comment from listener Pepito_GTO. Does anyone know why Skinwalker Ranch doesn't seriously dig the mesa?
That's a good question, and I think I can. I mean, the explanation I've heard is that mesa consists of huge boulders. It is not easy to. You're just not digging. You're removing boulders, which is really hard to do. Um, I would love them to dig into that mesa, but yeah, I think it's difficult to do, and there may be safety concerns too. I mean, if you honestly don't know what's there, it's potentially a hazard.
And it's very synchronous that that listener asked that question about Skinwalker Ranch, because we actually have the one and only Brandon Fugel coming on the show with us in a few weeks
Oh, that's great.
for a Skinwalker Ranch spotlight. And that episode will air on the same night as the season 5 premiere of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on the History Channel. So that night, you can tune in to our YouTube channel exclusively to watch Brandon Fugel live on All Things Unexplained. And immediately after the show, switch over to the History Channel for the season 5 premiere, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. And now some more unanswered questions from the AARO Report, Dr. Knuth. It seemed to be littered with breadcrumbs about strange materials. And it brought up this one notion of strange materials in the private sector. It said the organization claimed that the material they had in their possession had the potential to act as a terahertz frequency waveguide and therefore could exhibit anti-gravity and mass reduction properties under the appropriate conditions. Ultimately, however, the new report concluded AARO and a leading science laboratory said that the material is a metallic alloy, terrestrial in nature, and possibly of U.S. Air Force origin based on its materials characterization. So again, we've got strange materials in the private sector, but AARO says, well, they might be the Air Force. We're not for sure, but it's definitely terrestrial and nothing anomalous. And Dr. Knuth, this brings up an interesting dilemma. One thing I've always heard is that we essentially have the same chemicals and elements throughout the entire universe. So if we actually did have something extraterrestrial in our possession, how would we know that it was extraterrestrial?
And that is another difficult problem. If you had material from a crash, how would you identify that it didn't come from Earth? Everything in the universe is made up of all the same elements and all the same isotopes. Now, one way to tell that something is different, at least, would be to look at the isotope ratios. So a certain type of chemical is a chemical basically because chemistry acts using the electrons in the electron shell around the atoms. And the number of electrons equals the number of protons in the nucleus. But you can have extra neutrons, which don't have an electric charge, and that changes the mass of the atoms. So those are different isotopes. Different isotopes have different numbers of neutrons. So we know that certain chemicals on Earth, certain elements on Earth can have different isotopes. And we know on Earth naturally which isotopes occur with which proportions. So if you find a material that's been made where the isotope proportions don't match what you would expect to happen naturally on Earth, then you know that either somebody tampered with the isotopes in creating that object, or it perhaps came from somewhere else, did not come from Earth. You can't conclude, definitively that it didn't come from Earth, but you can at least conclude that it's not naturally occurring on Earth or had been somehow manipulated. So I don't know what the isotope, I don't know about any of the isotope studies for that particular material. That material was a layered piece of metal that consisted of, it was bismuth and magnesium, if I remember right. So they were nano layers of bismuth and magnesium, which is interesting because one of them is is diamagnetic and the other is paramagnetic. So they have different magnetic properties. And that has been that those properties have been used in creating new types of materials that we use for, that we're now experimenting with. They're called metamaterials, and they have special properties. And this particular piece of metal that had been tested acted like a terahertz waveguide. So terahertz is a very high frequency of radiation. So it's above radio. It has a higher frequency than radio waves, higher frequency than microwaves, but it's less than infrared light. So it sits in this region between microwaves and infrared light. And in fact, the scanners at airports where you got to put your hands up, those are terahertz devices. Now, we don't have much capability to work with terahertz, electromagnetic waves in the terahertz range. That's hard to do. And we're just learning how to do that. And so for this to be a terahertz waveguide is kind of interesting, but it's hard to know what it is. And for AARO to be claiming that this is consistent with materials that have been made by the Air Force, or that, well, let's see the evidence. I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical of anybody who comes to me that says they saw an alien spacecraft. I'm skeptical. But I'm also skeptical of government reports that claim things that don't provide evidence. So let's see the evidence that the Air Force is making things like this. I would like to see the evidence right through the claim. Easy to blow it off saying, oh yeah, we make these. And then we're supposed to just believe you. Look, this is the same organization that told us that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and we're supposed to just believe them? I'm skeptical and distrustful at this point. So let's see some honesty and openness, and maybe we can have a trusting relationship again.
Of course, this brings up another dilemma. If our own tech was sufficiently advanced and compartmentalized so that, other departments, other scientists, other military branches didn't know about it, and it was discovered by someone else, it would be so far advanced, how would they know if it's our tech or extraterrestrial tech or adversary tech? And then also, if it's true that we have reverse engineered advanced UFO technology, and so now it's a blend of advanced UFO technology and our technology, so it's some alien stuff and it's some of our stuff, how would we even know what's what?
Yeah, again, you wouldn't be able to prove that it came from extraterrestrial tech. You could just say that it was ours, and that would be, you're stuck again. Proving that something is extraterrestrial is extremely difficult, and I'm not sure that that's reasonable to do without a whole lot of evidence.
Well, let's look back at the AARO Report now and some more unanswered questions that it just left open, such as unknown science. And what if it's just science that's way beyond our knowledge limitations, sort of like what we were just talking about? It could be things like parallel dimensions, light speed travel, getting very near the speed of light or approaching the speed of light, or other remarkable physics advancements.
Right. And again, it would be hard to approach any of these without seeing evidence. And I think that's the standard that science holds for things, and we have to maintain that. And this is how we make progress, and this is how we're sure of ourselves when we do make progress. And so, that the having evidence is important, and that's one thing that the AARO report is lacking. There's a lot of references to other Air Force reports, that were much less well-founded than this one even.
So yes, it really does feel like AARO is just regurgitating previously used reports, and oftentimes it's reports that had their own errors, and they're just passing them off, as their own information. We were led to believe that one of AARO's prime directives was to gather evidence and assess it in new ways, and to tell us what their discoveries were, not just to regurgitate old information that was already out there, and flawed information at that.
Yeah, a previous, referring to a previous Air Force report is not evidence. That just shows consistency, and self consistency, which is not what we're interested in here, because the accusations are that they've been lying about this for 80 years. So let's see the actual evidence that shows that that isn't the case. The one of the Air Force reports that had been, that was referred to, talked about Roswell as having been due to a mistaken identity with a saucer-shaped Mars landing craft that was being tested. And that was actually stated in 1995. The Air Force claimed that Roswell crash was actually a Mars landing craft that was being tested. Well, wait a minute. Time out. First, where's the evidence of that? They provided no evidence. They simply made a claim. And they showed a picture of one of these, back shells for one of the Mars landing crafts. That looks like a saucer. Well, all right, now I'm convinced. No, I'm not convinced, actually, because I want to see the evidence. And the bigger question is, why would the Air Force have been testing a Mars landing craft in 1947, 10 years before we ever even launched a satellite into space? Before all scientists believed that space travel was actually possible, they're claiming that they were testing a Mars landing craft? Really? I want to see the evidence of that. That is ridiculous, is what that is. That's just silly. And it's clear they're lying, clear they're making stuff up, and again, makes them untrustworthy. My son, when he was little, he had this little book from the 1950s on basically, it was called How to Behave and Why. And I had actually intended to find that book and bring it here and read from it, because there's a whole chapter on lying and how when you lie, it means that no one can trust you after that. And it goes into this, explaining it to a little kid. And I think these people need to read this book, because they're just making stuff up and expecting us to believe it. A Mars landing craft in 1947, somebody was testing that? I call BS.
Like the little boy that cried
That's
wolf.
right. And then, so what does AARO do? AARO then refers to that document as a reputable source. That's even sillier. Come on, we can do better. We can do better than this. This is ridiculous.
The preponderance of all the things that they say Roswell could have been, besides an alien crash, at this point, it's so silly. It makes you believe that alien crash is the most likely explanation.
Oh, exactly. And I've said that before, because the first explanation that was given for that was put out by the Air Force itself, by the local Air Force, and they said that they captured a flying saucer. That was the first explanation. That was quashed within 24 hours. And then they said it was a weather balloon. And then they said it was, some project where they're dropping dummies from a water balloon. Well, why a weather balloon? Why are you dropping dummies from a weather balloon? And then why do you have to say that there was some saucer-shaped Mars lander? And then it's Project Mogul. Project Mogul, it turns out that the balloon that they supposedly would have had to have launched never got launched. If you look at the professor's records, who was actually running the program from NYU, if you look at those records, it was never launched. And then had it been launched, it would have had to have been launched on June 4th. And what were they doing with Project Mogul? Project Mogul was, they were trying to come up with a way to detect Soviet nuclear blasts. And the trick is they had to get their equipment up to 50,000 feet. And they had problems with using balloons to get it up to 50,000 feet, because once a balloon goes up, the air pressure goes down, so the balloon gets bigger, and the volume increases, which makes it even, the density go down even. So the thing keeps going up, keeps getting bigger, keeps going up, keeps getting bigger until it pops and the whole thing falls. That's what happens to these balloons. And they wanted one of these to hover at 50,000 feet. And so they were doing experiments to figure out how to do this. That's what that project was about. super secret project. Yeah, because of what they were trying to do. But is that really grounds for the hyperbolic response of the U.S. military when it was found? It had radar reflectors on it, so they should have been tracking it. So when it came down in Mac Brazel's ranch, they should have known it happened, and they should have collected it immediately, but they didn't. Nobody knew it came down there because it was days later that he then reports it to the sheriff, that reports it to the Air Force, and then they come and collect it, and then they detain him. They detain him for 5 days for a balloon experiment. Are you kidding me? And that balloon would have been launched, according to the professor's records. That balloon would have been launched on June 4th, and wasn't because of weather. And he notes that in his records. So now what's going on? And even if it had been launched on June 4th, are you to tell me that this balloon literally hangs out over New Mexico for a month or for 3 weeks? I just flew in from California 2 days ago, and we were at 30,000 feet, and we had a 146 mile an hour tailwind at 30,000 feet. This thing's at 50,000 feet, and there's no winds at all, and the thing just hangs over Roswell, New Mexico for 3 weeks, and then falls on Mac Brazel's ranch. It's the silliest thing I've ever heard. And this is one of the things that's crazy about these prosaic explanations about, on the for these UFO events, is the prosaic explanations are more ridiculous than what people are claiming. It's almost more probable to believe that there was an alien spacecraft there than to believe that there was some mysterious balloon that got launched that wasn't actually launched, that then hovered over New Mexico for 3 weeks and then fell on the guy's ranch. And then nobody knew it because nobody was tracking it with the radar like they were supposed to. None of it makes sense. None of it. But you have to look at it. You can't just, but people don't. They almost depend on people. They almost rely on people not paying attention, because nobody looks up to see what Project Mogul actually was and what was supposed to be happening and when the balloon was supposed to be launched. And when you do it, you realize it doesn't fit at all, which is why they have to constantly move from one explanation to another. The Air Force has given, 4 or 5 explanations for Roswell over the last 80 years. And that's because none of them hold any water. And what does that lead you to believe? It means that when somebody's lying like this, it means that the first explanation was probably the correct one. The first explanation that everybody wanted to quash is probably the right one. They probably caught a flying saucer. That's the only thing you can walk away with. Of course, there's no evidence for it, but we don't have evidence for any of this stuff.
So I was lucky enough to recently take a trip out to Roswell, New Mexico. And I have to say, before I went, I didn't really know where I was going. I had no plans. I had nothing set in stone. And I got out there, and the next thing you know, I ended up at the actual Roswell UFO crash site. So here I am. It's like a scene out of Breaking Bad. I'm taking my rental car 2 hours out into the desert. No cell phone service. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, a lot of things could go bad out here right now. But it was fantastic. We went way off-road into the crash site, and we had a metal detector, which I got to use, which was incredible. And we actually found some anomalous things. I found something, and some of the people I was with found some things that I can only describe as little rectangular, anomalous pieces of metal. That's the best way I know how to describe them. And another thing that really bothers me about how they frame all of these situations like the Roswell encounter, we are constantly bombarded with the notion that our military is the best and the brightest, and I believe that. I believe they are the best and the brightest, the most capable military force in the history of the world. But when it comes to UFOs, they're treated like Keystone Cops. And I just think that is so disrespectful.
Yeah, it's a disservice to our military. It's irresponsible when you consider our military pilots who aren't being told what's actually in their skies, and it's disrespectful to all the experiencers, all the people who have actually seen these things and encountered these things. We've been laughing at them for 80 years, and that's not right. They've been seeing things, and they have information, and scientists haven't been paying attention. The U.S. government pretends it doesn't happen, and I think that's really a problem.
That is so frustrating to me because AARO will tell you things like there's no data, but I'm here to tell you that's data. Okay, witness accounts, witness testimony, that is data. That is qualitative data. You know, it doesn't all have to be quantitative, that is mathematical data. Qualitative witness accounts data is just as valid as mathematical data. All right, it is now time for our Area 51 Coffee Company Hot Takes segment. This is brought to you by Area 51 Coffee Company. Get yours at area51coffeeco.com. This hot take involves a scientist by the name of Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger, based in Switzerland. She actually went on a podcast recently and had some very intriguing things to say about experiments going on at CERN, C-E-R-N, CERN.
Radionuclear research. But it is more than that, because there are lots of physicians, I know some, they're doing very strange experimentation. There are beings from portals coming in and out. It's physicists from the CERN who told me this.
They've testified to beings coming in and out of portals.
Yes. They have apparently in the bottom of the CERN this portal, this door where they are dealing with all the subatomic dimensions. They say there are 17 different dimensions of reality. That's what those physicists say. Some others say there are more dimensions, you know. And now, when you look at what is going on in the CERN, there is a fight from some of the military agencies. Intel, they say that there is a fight on time. They're trying to change time.
What's my hot take on it? Well, these things are hard. I've not heard about anything like this. And again, I'm going to be that skeptical scientist. I'm skeptical till I see some evidence. And if I'm going to hold that standard for all the work I do, and I'm going to hold that same standard for AARO, I'm going to have to hold it for this scientist as well. We need to see some evidence that this is happening. It's hard to imagine, but a lot of these things are hard to imagine, and that doesn't mean it's not true. So that's the way I typically handle it. Is I treat it as interesting, and I file it away in a place where it's accessible in my mind, so that if I see something else that is commensurate with that or supports that or anything, I can then pull that back and say, oh, yes, and this is like what Dr. Astrid Stuckelberger was talking about CERN, and then I will then look at it further. But make a mental note of it, and I think that's that's how I typically handle these things. But I'd like to see some evidence. I'd love to see some evidence. That would be fantastic.
And Dr. Knuth, I've had this thought experiment with some other people. What if one of your dearest, most respected friends came to you and said, I've been abducted by aliens, or I was told that beings are coming through a portal at CERN, or some other anomalous experience? What would you think about that?
Well, I mean, I don't disbelieve them again, but I am skeptical. So I would just make a mental note of it, and especially if it's a friend I trust, and if they had personal experience with it, I would, of course, I'd hold that in higher regard. But I don't just disbelieve people. I think that's silly too. You don't believe people and disbelieve people based on whether what they say makes sense to you. That's not how it works. We spend all day long listening to anecdotes from people and believing them all day. and don't have any problems with it. But when it's a little weird, we then all of a sudden, well, you can't believe what people tell you. Well, I mean, you do all day long, and you couldn't function if you didn't. And so I think it's important to listen to people, and it's important to take note of that.
And speaking of weird and mind-bending, it's my understanding that you have watched some of the episodes of Three Body Problem on Netflix. What's your hot take on Three Body Problem?
I have. I've read about half of the first book, and I've watched about half of the episodes, so that I think I'm about in the same place in both. Oh, I'm loving it. It's great fun. Yeah, it's an excellent story, and there's a lot that I like about it. It's a good thinking story, and a lot to think about. And especially, these. Yeah, I don't want to say any spoilers, but there's a lot to think about in watching the story, and there's, and a good story makes you think about yourself as much as that you are thinking about other things. I'm trying to think if there's a way to say something without having a spoiler. The fact that we humans are have so much trouble getting along with each other, and makes it and are basically almost irredeemable in some sense, makes it incredibly difficult for others to trust us as well. We have a lot of problems, and that really comes through in this story. In fact, so far what I've seen is it's more about us than it is about anybody else.
Now back to the AARO report, and we're going to take a look at the AARO report errors in part. This is from Hanks of the Debrief, March 14th, 2024. And right off the bat, they say the late Senator Harry Reid was from New Mexico when in fact he was actually from Nevada. This is just mind-blowingly sloppy, in my opinion. Dr. Knuth, I feel like you would actually take away points if one of your students had this in a paper.
Yeah, you hit a number of them there. I see you've got a good number of them there. That's right. Yeah, well, I mean, the first two errors you have especially are especially mind-blowing. You don't get the state that a senator's from right? Really? In a federal report? Really? How do you pull that off and keep your job? I don't know. It shows that it's sloppy. It's poorly done. You can't even get the simple stuff right. You can Google Harry Reid and find out that he's from Nevada. You can the Kenneth Arnold sighting. I checked on Wikipedia. They have the correct date on Wikipedia. What he said June 23rd in the AARO report. Go to Wikipedia. It's June 24th, and then you can verify that it is June 24th. An 8th grader would have gotten it right. So how can you hold anything to high regard when you have mistakes like this? I've been a scientific journal editor for 12 years now, actually, I think 13. If I saw a scientific paper that had these mistakes in it, I'd reject it flat out. It would be rejected. And that's really pretty ironic, considering that the AARO report actually states that there have been no academic suggestions that these things are extraterrestrial or non-human. And when that's entirely wrong, because I did that in my paper, and that was peer-reviewed scientific paper. And so it's ironic that they're holding, scientific standards to such high regard and academic standards to such high regard, but this report doesn't even meet those standards, doesn't come anywhere near.
And some of the other reports, they had the wrong date for the 1947 Kenneth Arnold sighting. They seem to confuse Project Bear with Project Stork. They even reported and seemed to misconstrue the percentage of quality sightings that remain unexplained. They referred to the former director of Project Blue Book, Tuskegee Airman Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jones Friend. They referred to him as Roger J. Friend. They appear to have reprinted findings of past UAP studies, some of which themselves had inaccurate findings, such as the Condon Committee.
So what's going to this is an opportunity actually, in some ways, because what's going to happen is that some of us from the academic community who have been studying UFOs now for several years are going to write our own reports, correct these mistakes, and provide much more information, correct information. This is going to get corrected and corrected by the people who've been studying this. And so I see this. So rather than being depressed about this, I see this as an opportunity.
Is that a teaser that you just gave us?
I'm sorry? Yeah, it's a bit of a teaser. Yep. Yeah, I'll contribute to some degree. I don't have time to do a whole report like this. I wish the Pentagon would have paid me to do it. I'd have done a much better job. I'd have at least gotten the first two right. And then we're going to see it come from multiple groups. Multiple groups are going to do this, and some are going to work together. Some are going to do it separately. But that's what's going to happen, and I think that's going to be a positive thing that comes out of this. The first two mistakes right there show you can't trust any of it. That's what basically says. You can't have I tell my students this all the time when they're presenting scientific talks. I said, you make any mistake in your slides, and then nobody's going to believe anything that's in your report. There's no reason to believe it, because if you can't get a simple thing right, you certainly can't get a complicated thing right. And so the AARO report is really useless and really pointless. And it's in some ways, I'm also grateful because it allows us to say that, and it's showing its true colors blatantly, which is a good thing. We know that they didn't do their job. I mean, Kirkpatrick didn't write this himself, but he did sign off on it. And I'm sorry, when you're a co-author, you need to read the report and you need to perform due diligence and make sure that it's done correctly. And he didn't. I don't think his heart was in this job at all. He was not. I don't think that he was interested in it at all. And very much like what happened with the Condon Committee, where they did a half-beat job on it as well, where they couldn't explain, a large percentage, large, I mean more than 5% of the cases, and then said, well, there's nothing to see here. I mean, clearly they're not doing their jobs there. And this is standard, and this is what's been going on for 80 years. And this has been the trick that's been used, is that you just have to have some official report that says that it's nonsense, and then half the people believe that it's nonsense. And that's how it works. But it's been used over and over, and this you can go through the Condon report and find all sorts of problems with that too. And it's ridiculous. It doesn't take a lot of work to cover this up, because most people don't want to believe it in the first place. And so all you got to do is plant a seed of doubt, and an official report is enough doubt to just throw everybody off.
And there's a tendency in the AARO paper to pull the data, it seems, that supports the AARO position and leave out the data that might argue against it. This comes from someone you might know named Robert Powell of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies.
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned Robert Powell, because he's with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. I loved his assessment of this, by the way. I thought it was dead on. Robert's a good guy, and he knows what he's doing. And in fact, the one thing that is barely touched on in this report, I don't even know if it's mentioned, I didn't see it, are the incursions at nuclear weapon sites and nuclear facilities. Nothing. That's a national security issue that somebody ought to be saying something about. Now, if you go to the SCU website, so this is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. They have published. They put out a paper. Ian Porritt, Larry Hancock, and Sean Grosvenor put out a paper called UAP Pattern Recognition Study, 1945 to 1975 U.S. Military Atomic Warfare Complex, where they basically I'll read the first sentence. They provides a view of the pattern of reported unidentified aerospace phenomena in the United States associated with the military atomic weapons complex between 1945 and 1975. So they published this paper last year. It's 63 pages long. 63 pages long. How long is the AARO report? They're both 63 pages long. That's interesting. That's surprising. Interesting coincidence. So you've got, on one hand, you've got the SCU put out a paper on UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites that's 63 pages long, the same length as the entire AARO report, which is supposed to cover the whole history, volume 1 of the history, right? What's wrong with this picture? The AARO report is again lacking, severely lacking.
The sense that what's really happening here is what Colonel Moultrie said at one of the first UFO hearings before Congress, which is this.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Now, Dr. Knuth, you told us the first time you were on the show that you really first started getting interested in UFOs because of one of your professors in college and the stories that they would tell you about UFO incursions at nuclear plants in Montana.
I heard about that in 1988 when I started graduate school at Montana State University. One of our physics professors told us about the fact that at Malmstrom Air Force Base in northern Montana, they were having problems, present tense, with UFO incursions on the ICBM missile sites where they were shutting down ICBM missiles. So I heard of that from a physics professor. And later learned, 30 years later, learned that Robert Salas was at Malmstrom Air Force Base, the same base, in 1967, 66 and 67, and they were having problems then, the same types of problems. I also later learned, just last year went down to visit our family for Mardi Gras in Louisiana, and learned that from my wife's uncle Matt, had been stationed at Malmstrom in the early 70s, and he knew all about the UFO incursions shutting down ICBM missile sites. So this, in some sense, this is common knowledge among certain groups of people, but not important enough for the AARO report. There's something wrong here. There's a big thing. There's some big things wrong here, and you really can't help but worry.
Again, it appears that the AARO report simply cherry-picked the studies and the data that supported their conclusions. And they, meanwhile, ignored other groundbreaking studies on the subject, such as a study that might sound very familiar to you, Dr. Knuth, estimating flight characteristics of anomalous, unidentified aerial vehicles, which unveiled shocking physics. This, of course, is your paper, along with a couple of co-authors. And among the shocking physics it talks about is the fact that these Tic Tacs in the Nimitz encounter were estimated to be traveling at 45,000 miles per hour, which would make them more than capable of interstellar travel.
Now, this leads to another problem with the AARO report and with AARO altogether, is that I published this paper, and Robert Powell and Peter Reale are co-authors. They're both from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. We published this paper, and last February briefed AARO. Our UAPX team briefed AARO, and they knew of this paper. They had a copy of it. They knew about it. And this was actually on one of our slides. He then was questioned by Senator Gillibrand the next, what would that have been, March of last year, as to whether there had been any academic peer-reviewed papers published suggesting that these things were extraterrestrial, and he said no. And in fact, it says that in the AARO report. He says that in the beginning of one of the sections. Let me find this. This is section 2, I believe, on page 13, or no, section 2, page 7, section 2. So we can go to page 7, section 2. Executive summary: AARO found no evidence that any USG investigation academic sponsored research, that's my paper, or official panel review has confirmed any sighting of a UAP represented extraterrestrial technology. So they are denying the existence of this paper, which is problematic because, heck, the Israelis know about this paper. So so I can point you to the report written by Frank Milburn titled The Pentagon's UAP Task Force, written for BISA, which is the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University, Israel. And in this paper, they actually quote my paper. And I will read the paragraph. I'll read the paragraph from my paper in the Israeli report to highlight the fact that the Israelis know this and have discussed it. So they say one scientific study, quote, estimating flight characteristics of anomalous unidentified aerial vehicles notes, and this is what I said in the paper, estimated accelerations range from almost 100 G to thousands of Gs with no observed air disturbance, no sonic booms, and no evidence of excessive heat commensurate with even the minimal estimated energies. ... In many cases, the number and quality of witnesses and the equipment used to track and record the craft favor the latter hypothesis that these are indeed technologically advanced craft. The observed flight characteristics are consistent with the flight characteristics required for interstellar travel. If these observed accelerations were sustainable in space, then these craft could easily reach relativistic speeds within a matter of minutes to hours and cover interstellar distances in a matter of days to weeks proper time. So that is a quote from my paper, a peer-reviewed scientific paper that assesses UAP speeds. That was quoted in an Israeli military think tank report. But AARO makes no mention of this, and in fact states that no papers of such type exist.
And I find that so frustrating because your academic paper is a clear, definitive scientific repudiation that these phenomenon have all prosaic explanations. Meanwhile, the AARO report says these phenomenon do have all prosaic explanations, and then even says, hey, there are no scientific papers to the contrary.
And the AARO report denies that paper exists. Explicitly states that it doesn't. So we have another big problem. And in fact, what the AARO report also doesn't cover is the talk given by Herman Oberth. Herman Oberth is a rocketry pioneer. He was mentor to Wernher von Braun. In 1954, Herman Oberth gave a talk on flying saucers. And in that talk, he notes that they had been tracked on radar reaching speeds up to 19 kilometers a second, which is about 42,000 miles an hour, which is not that different than what I'm computing here. That was noted by Herman Oberth in 1954, public talk. And he then goes on to state that had it just been one or two radar observations, he would hold off until more data were collected before believing that. But he had seen up to, or at least 50 radar observations of UAP that support that fact. So this was well known by some people in 1954, that these things were traveling at spacecraft speeds, 40,000 miles an hour. That's the speed of the New Horizons probe that passed Pluto and is currently in the outer solar system. The space shuttle and space station only go like 17,000 miles an hour, only half of that. So UAPs have been tracked going faster than our space station, and noted by Herman Oberth in 1954 with over 50 radar observations. Why aren't any of these in the AARO report? Why is this not noted? 1954. Do you know what the airspeed record was in 1954? I don't know the exact number. It's around 700 miles an hour. Certainly not 40,000 miles an hour. Give me a break. It's obvious what's going on, and this is a whitewash. It's ridiculous. I think you just got my reaction.
Okay, I think this would be a great time to get your reaction to an interview that Dr. Kirkpatrick did soon after his exit from AARO, in which he addressed the fact that the Nimitz encounter with the Tic Tacs was not in the AARO report. Let's have a listen. This comes to us via Mike Colangelo on Twitter.
I testified multiple times on the fact that Tic Tac, there's some great eyewitness accounts of what is described as the Tic Tac. What was lacking is data, right? So I worked with one of the pilots to try to tease out a little bit more of what exactly was it that we were potentially witnessing, and by the descriptions of everything from water disturbance to motion, relative motion, and how you can maybe see what you're seeing. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is, I think that one, my opinion is that one is going to remain unresolved because there is no data. There is no radar data. Allegations of the secret black helicopter that came and picked up the tapes. None of that happened. There's no evidence that somebody pulled the tapes off. What does happen, and this is why we had to change the data retention policy, was all of these platforms have fixed storage or a fixed amount of storage, and they only retain the data for any given mission, maybe a day, and unless there is a problem with the platform that they use the data for diagnostics for. And then the next time that platform goes out, the data is overwritten. So there's no conspiracy in that. That's just how the military operates with these data tapes and whatnot. So we did write new policy that said, hey, look, if you're reporting a UAP, you have to save all of that data and transmit it to AARO within some period of time. So I think the Tic Tac is so far back in time, there's no data. And we went and looked for all the data. But the other thing that I asked around a bit, which I don't know, it certainly hadn't been answered by the time I left, was, there wasn't a lot of asking or questioning of other activities that might have been going on at the time, either naval activities or adversary activities. And both of those needed to be explored at that time, because records of when tests, for example, were done that far back in time may not be accurate or exist, and records of any adversary activity will be hard to track down for exact date and time stamps, right? And those are the kinds of things that you want to get.
It's hard to disagree with a lot of that. It's I think his statement that the black helicopter that took all the data is, and that just saying that didn't happen, I think is extremely questionable, considering that people on the Nimitz said it happened. And I know some of these people, and some of those people had something to do with the data. So they said, there is no data, so yeah, that's the problem. There's no data. And whether the data was taken, whether it was on a short-term storage, at this point, it doesn't matter. There's no data. So we have to, you either take the word of the radar operator in describing what he saw, and That would be Senior Chief Kevin Day or Gary Voorhees, who worked with the Spy 1 radar system and worked on the reconstructions of what happened and described what they saw. I trust them, and I trust what they describe. And I trust Fravor when he says that this thing shot off like a bullet out of a gun. It was gone within 2 seconds. We did the calculation on how fast it would have had to accelerate for that to happen as well. And in all the cases that we looked at, the verbal description from Kevin Day about the objects dropping from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds, the object disappearing from view in less than 2 seconds from Fravor, and the actual video, all of them showed abnormally high accelerations.
They ignore qualitative data, so data from eyewitness accounts.
I mean, he's a physicist, and physicists want hard data. I don't think you can ignore it. I think he's choosing to ignore it. That's the problem. The data also exists. The data also exists for the Japanese airline case, JAL 1628, and Dr. Daniel Kumbe, who was at the Niels Bohr Institute, analyzed that in detail. In my paper, we only analyzed the summary of what was described. Daniel Kumbe took it a step further, actually got the radar data and analyzed that and found accelerations of the large walnut-shaped craft, which was described by the pilot to be 3 747s in length, which is about the size of an aircraft carrier. Dr. Kumbe found that thing was several instances accelerating up to 9,000 Gs with a top speed of 250,000 miles an hour. The 250,000 miles an hour that can get you to the moon in about 50 minutes. 50 minutes. You could go to the moon and have lunch and come back easily. And at those speeds and accelerations. At some point you don't know what to say anymore. And we're going to ignore Hermann Oberth's claim about these things moving at 19 kilometers a second back in 1954. He said there were at least 50 radar records of that. Where are all these records? I mean, who has them? That's an important question.
One of the many things that bothered me about the AARO report was that it just completely ignored the intimidation and the trauma that so many of these military personnel with the Nimitz and or the Princeton had to deal with. For example, Kevin Day and others, this literally was a traumatizing event that changed their lives. For some of them, it ruined their lives. And to just simply call this prosaic phenomenon for which there's no data and nothing really to see, it really does a disservice to these folks who were deeply affected by what they experienced.
It all gets hard to explain, right? If you're just going to believe the Pentagon and AARO, then it gets hard to explain. I think the prosaic explanation here is that they are not telling the truth. They're either not telling the truth or purposefully or just trying not to do their jobs, and I think that's a problem. When 97% of the cases are clearly, easily explained, and you focus on 5% of those and talk about them, and you ignore that other 3%, it all looks silly. Exactly.
Dr. Knuth, one thing you did recently that drew a lot of praise was your presentation at the Soul Foundation.
Oh, thank you.
And I watched your presentation again recently on YouTube. It has over 127,000
My
views.
God, that's a lot. It's a lot.
3 of the things that really drew my attention from your presentation was the mention of USOs, unidentified submersed objects or submersible objects, so underwater, handheld nuclear reactors. So you have a friend apparently that's working on a new invention for a handheld nuclear reactor to attract UFOs, and the potential for some upcoming field expeditions.
Right. Yeah, I did talk about USOs, and I have a little more information about that case from New Zealand that I'm now looking at in some detail. I mentioned that my colleague was working toward designing a new type of nuclear reactor, which he's now done some tests and it actually works. This big, pretty cool. But we don't really have plans. It was inspired by an idea. It was inspired by an idea at lunch where it would be cool to use a nuclear reactor to try to lure in UFOs. It would not be safe to do this. You can't just run around with a nuclear reactor. I'm a professional physicist, and I know better, and he knows better, and he's designed this. Matthew Shadagas has designed this, and under with the university's approval, and he's followed all the safety procedures, and he's done a very nice job, very professional, and he's getting it patented. So it's a big deal. It's a really cool invention, and I wish him the best in getting it all working. I would love to use one if I could. I mean, the one that's this big, I think, could conceivably power a house for 1,000,000 years. So, I mean, this is very possibly transformative. It's a big deal. And then let's see, field expeditions. Yeah, I'd love to do more field expeditions. I recently went to visit the Tedesco brothers who are working on Long Island. They put a book out on Amazon called Nightcrawler about some of their studies of UAPs off the coast of Long Island. And I went observing for 2 nights with them about 2 weeks ago, which was great fun. I got to see their equipment, and we talked about equipment, and we didn't see anything, of course, but because you never do, right? It's actually hard to. It takes some persistence, and they have a lot of energy and a lot of persistence, and I got to give them a lot of credit for that. That's pretty fantastic. I got to see some of their videos that they've taken, and some of them are really interesting and compelling. So they have collected some data, and we've talked about working together to some degree and collecting more. So I think I'd love to get some more of my equipment together and go back out with them and do some more observing this spring. That would be great fun.
Dr. Knuth, we have some listener questions for you. This one comes from Eli on YouTube. Jacques Vallée theorizes UAPs could be traveling interdimensionally. Very interesting theory, Eli says. Perhaps UAPs might give the scientific community the opportunity to test those advanced theories. Thoughts?
Yes, that has been proposed. I'm not quite sure what it means to be interdimensional, and there are different ways to look at that. The theoretical work that I've done suggests that there are 3 dimensions, and that's it, period. And I have a hard time visualizing other dimensions, although there can be other ways to do things other than additional dimensions. And the multiverse is just one example. But yeah, I mean, UAPs, if we could collect some good data on them, we might learn. I mean, there's a great number of things that we can probably learn from these objects, and I would very much like to do so.
Okay, so next from 2Jacks on YouTube. This has caused quite a stir on Twitter recently. This is dealing with Professor Simon Holland. If you get a chance before the end, can you ask Dr. Knuth if he has any thoughts on Professor Simon Holland, who states, "We received pictures from other life forms via SETI in 2019.
That I don't know anything about. I'll have to look into that. Thank you for informing me. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful.
So I actually have a question for you myself, Dr. Knuth. And I wonder, there's a phenomenon happening right now where academics and scientists, they're becoming larger than life personalities in this whole UFO phenomenon experience in ufology. So they're literally becoming larger than life superstars. So what's your thoughts on this phenomenon?
Yeah, those are real concerns. I worry about that myself, especially after doing the Netflix's Encounters show. I was on episode 3, and I think it turned out very nicely. I'm really happy about it, and thank you. That's very kind of you. Um, I just hope that one person who hasn't watched my soul presentation 127,000 times doesn't decide to watch that 127,000 times. But 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 I do worry about. I mean, and I have filmed for other shows now that will be coming out in the next year. But I do worry about that when I'm on TV, and I as a physicist, I'm very much an introvert, so it's hard for me to do the television shows, and I find that difficult. I joke. There's always the joke on how do you identify the extroverted physicist. He's the guy looking at the other person's shoes when talking to someone. So I feel that acutely, and I think that's difficult because depending on the shows and the way that we're portrayed in the shows, that can really affect our credibility in the scientific community, I think, and I worry about that. I worked hard in my career and have a lot of credibility, but I don't want to blow it being on a silly TV show if I'm not careful. So I think it's a worrisome thing, but it can be helpful too, because people do need to hear what some of us scientists are thinking about and doing. And science is very bad at communicating anything, basically. So so having better science communicators is an important thing. And many of the more popular past science communicators really fall short when it comes to this UAP topic. They're somehow UFOs get mentioned and their brains go out the window, and they say silly things. And I think that it's important to talk, frankly and seriously about this topic. It's an important topic, and it's important for a lot of reasons. This is potentially a national security issue. It's actually a global security issue. These things aren't just natural. There's a global security issue. There's a safety issue when it comes to pilots, and you don't want one of these objects to come flying at the windscreen of a passenger jet when you've got a pilot, with 250 people in the back who are just trying to get home. You know how hard it is. Air travel is hard enough the way it is. I wouldn't want to have to deal with that. And then there are people who encounter these things, who see these things, who aren't, who can't really, who have this fantastic experience and can't really share it without being made fun of. That's hard. And then there is the whole abduction phenomenon, which is not clear that that's nonsense either. I know several people now who have claimed to have been abducted, and it sounds entirely possible. I believe them, and I think that that's an issue too. And so then there are, and some of these people have these experiences have been traumatic and have had a huge effect on them in their lives. And to not be believed and not be able to share those experiences with others is really criminal. It's hard. So I'd like to support those people too. And I think I can do that by talking seriously about the topic. And I think that, let's look at the topic. Let's collect data. Let's be skeptical and be careful, and let's see what we can find out. But to just, to write a report and make 8th grade level mistakes, and and then just say there's nothing to see here, it's all nonsense, and there's this culture of nonsense that's been perpetuated, I think is really unfair.
Circling back on the abduction phenomenon, abductions are a natural extension of the UFO phenomenon. If we accept that there are these objects, then the next place we go is who's in control of them, and what are these beings in control of them, and what do they want, and what are they taking from us, if anything? What are they doing to us? So what's your thoughts on this natural extension of the abduction phenomenon and the UFO phenomenon in general, a connection between the beings that are actually in control of the craft?
Well, there's a lot of questions there that come into play. If you were to take the non-human intelligence hypothesis and run with it a little bit, then the idea that they do interact with people at some level, perhaps abductions, is not improbable. I mean, would make some kind of sense. And then, but then you have to start worrying about what their hello, Julie. But then you have to start worrying about what the implications are and what their intentions are. Um, and that becomes really difficult. And I think that if they are operating, we don't know to what level they interact with humanity and what their intentions are, and are they able to control people's perceptions or desires to study this or desires to cover it up to some degree. I mean, are they what is the involvement here? What are the interactions? And I think that this whole topic, if the non-human aspects do turn out to be correct, then there's a whole other kettle of fish to worry about. Australia, hello. You guys are up early. Thank you. It's kind of you.
We love our fans in Australia. We have more than one group of fans out there. And one of the things I love about our fans in Australia is that they are old school ufologists. In other words, they get out in the field and they look at the skies and they collect data. And that's how they do ufology.
Well, I think we can collect our own data. This is what we're trying to do at UAPX, and my friends and colleagues are trying to do at in the Galileo project, in the IFEX project in Würzburg, Germany, with Professor Hakan Kayal, and Beatrix Villarroel in the Vasco project. Well, she's looking at old data, old telescope imagery. But I think that we can collect our own data and we can learn some things. Wow, and it's actually in the early afternoon, and I guess it's late here. I guess it's 11 p.m. here in New York. So yeah, it would be. I lost track of time. I flew in from California yesterday, so I'm still jet lagged. I have no idea what time it is. I was in Big Sur, and the highway collapsed, and they had to evacuate us. We had to head out by half of the highway washed into the sea down the cliff, and then we had to be evacuated by convoy. It was quite exciting. Yeah.
Was that a landslide?
No, I don't know what caused it. Yeah, there was a landslide, but part of the highway cut along the cliff and had supports under it, and then but that whole lane fell into the ocean, and then they closed off the highway, and they had a convoy. They had assessed the safety, and they had a convoy head north to get out of the Big Sur area by just driving in that lane, but it was all well controlled, so nobody else went into the ocean.
Well, we sure are glad you made it back okay.
Well, thank you.
We can't thank you enough for joining us on the show tonight. You're so generous with your time. We really appreciate you, Dr. Knuth.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Shout out to Smitty and CJ, who cannot be with us tonight.
Yeah, I'm sorry CJ couldn't join us. Hello, CJ. We missed you.
One thing I would like to ask all the listeners, if you want to help us out, make sure to subscribe, comment, like, and share. It really helps us defeat the evil algorithms that are trying to prevent disclosure. You can also head over to our website at bigfootufo.com, and you'll find lots of ways that you can support the show there. Dr. Knuth, what are your final thoughts?
Be skeptical. Be equally skeptical of people who tell you fantastical things as you, and be that same skepticism should be directed toward, Kirkpatrick and AARO and others. They need to provide evidence too. We need evidence. We need evidence because we need to figure out what's going on for real and get past this. As you were describing, the people in Australia collecting, data from the skies. Do it, please. Yeah, collect information. Multiple cameras simultaneously so you can triangulate. Let's find out what's going on, and we can. I'm convinced that once we get in fact, once we get several scientific groups out there collecting data, it won't take us more than 20 years to figure out what's going on. We can solve this. This is solvable. It's knowable. It's understandable.
The truth is out there, and folks like Dr. Kevin Knuth are going to lead the way in finding the truth. He's putting in work. He's getting out in the field. He's doing legitimate science to pursue the truth of the UFO phenomenon, and we really appreciate him for doing it. Thanks to all the listeners out there. We really appreciate you. Remember, you can subscribe, comment, like, and share to really help us out, or visit BigfootUFO.com for lots of ways to help us out. On behalf of Smitty and CJ, I am Dr. Mounts with All Things Unexplained, and here are my final thoughts. There was a time not that long ago where everyone around the globe believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. And thanks to scientists like Dr. Knuth, who were dedicated in their pursuit of the truth, no matter the cost, no matter the dangers, society was able to move forward. And we are very much in that same situation right now, and it's going to take all of us, citizens and scientists alike, to get off our screens, head out in the woods, look up at the sky, and see what's out there. The truth is still out there. Folks, if you get out in the woods, look up at the sky, like someone told us recently, you might find more than UFOs. You might find a little bit more of yourself. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, Unexplained Ones, are you ready for your next adventure? Then look no further than UFO Watchtower in Hooper, Colorado. Experience the wonder of the cosmos with guided tours, skywatching events, and first-hand accounts of their over 300 UFO sightings. Whether you're a seasoned ufologist or just curious, the UFO Watchtower welcomes you to explore the mysteries of the universe. They are currently open on weekends for tours or during the week for camping. Give them a call at 719-378-2296 to book your trip today.
Thanks. Like, share, follow, comment, subscribe, support. What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
More at BigfootUFO.com.
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, will save for closed session.